Welcome. Find a comfortable position. Perhaps you're already in it, or perhaps you shifted slightly just now, adjusting the pillow or moving your feet to a cooler part of the bed, and perhaps that adjustment was exactly right, and now everything is arranged as well as it can be arranged, and the blanket is the right weight, and the room is the right kind of dark, and there is nothing pressing itself on your attention from outside, just the ordinary quiet sounds of a house settling into the night. That is good. That is exactly where we want to be. There is nothing you need to do right now. There is nowhere you need to be. There is only this slow and unhurried story about people who work the same fields year after year in a world that moved at the pace of a horse pulling a plough, which is a slow pace, which is the right pace for a story you are going to fall asleep inside. This is a story about medieval farmers, not about the lords who owned the land, because the lords had dramatic lives, and dramatic lives are not what we are here for. Not about the great harvests and the great famines and the political upheavals that changed who owned what, because those too carry a kind of weight that wakes the mind rather than settling it. We are here for the person who got up before sunrise and walked to the field and began the same work they had begun yesterday and would begin again tomorrow. We are here for the oxen moving at their steady pace up and down the furrow, and the soil turning behind the plough in a continuous dark ribbon, and the birds that followed close behind looking for what had been turned up, and the farmer at the end of the furrow turning the plough and the oxen together in a wide arc and beginning the next pass. We are here for the slow, patient work of cultivating the earth, described carefully and without any hurry at all, because that is exactly what this kind of evening calls for. So let us begin. The field is waiting, the oxen are yoked, the morning is cold and grey and the frost is still on the ground, and there is a long day ahead with nothing in it that has not been in many days before it. Chapter 1. The Village and its Fields. The medieval farming village was not a random collection of houses scattered across a landscape. It was an organised community with a specific relationship to the land around it, a relationship that had been worked out over generations and that was expressed in the arrangement of the fields and the commons and the meadows and the woodland that made up the agricultural territory of the village. Understanding this arrangement is the starting point for understanding what the daily work of the medieval farmer actually consisted of, and it is the kind of understanding that settles comfortably into the mind without requiring any effort to hold it there. The most common arrangement of farmland in medieval England and much of northern Europe was the open field system. Under this system, the arable land of the village was divided into 2 or 3 large fields, and each of these large fields was further divided into strips, which were long narrow sections of land, typically a furlong in length, which is approximately 200 metres and about 4 to 6 metres wide. Each farmer in the village held a number of these strips, and the strips of different farmers were intermixed across the field rather than grouped together, so that a farmer's holding was not a single block of land but a collection of strips scattered through the field in a pattern that gave each farmer both good land and poor land, rather than any one farmer getting all the best or all the worst. The strips were separated from each other, not by fences or walls, but by a narrow unploughed ridge called a balk, which served as a boundary marker and also as a path between the strips. Over years and decades of ploughing, the soil turned by the plough tended to accumulate toward the centre of each strip, so that the strips developed a slightly raised profile, a gentle ridge down the centre with a shallow depression on each side, a topographic pattern called ridge and furrow that can still be seen in many English pastures today, where the land has never been ploughed in the modern period. Standing in a field of ridge and furrow and looking along the length of the ridges is a quiet and specific experience. The regular undulations of the ground telling a story of repeated ploughing that is very old and very patient. The 2 or 3 field system meant that one field was always resting, lying fallow for a year while the other fields were cultivated. The fallow field was not wasted. It was grazed by the animals of the village, whose dung fertilized it, and it was also ploughed once or twice during the fallow year to aerate the soil and control the weeds. The rotation of the crops through the fields, the decisions about what to plant where and when to leave which field fallow, was managed collectively by the village, because the system only worked if everyone followed the same rotation, and departures from the rotation by individual farmers would have disrupted the whole arrangement. The meadow was a separate part of the village's agricultural territory, ground that was too wet or too prone to flooding to be ploughed reliably, and that was therefore managed as grassland, cut for hay in the summer and used as pasture in the winter. The hay from the meadow was essential for feeding the animals through the winter, and the rights to cut hay from specific portions of the meadow were carefully defined and carefully respected, because an insufficient hay supply meant the animals would have to be slaughtered before winter was out, which meant less ploughing power and less manure and less milk in the following year, a consequence that had consequences in the interconnected way that agricultural systems always have. The commons were the shared grazing land of the village, the rougher ground at the edges of the cultivated area where animals could graze from the time the crops were planted until the harvest was in, and then more freely after the harvest, when the stubble of the harvested fields was also available. The rights to graze animals on the commons were defined by custom, each household entitled to graze a certain number of animals, the total number calibrated to what the commons could support without being overgrazed. Managing the commons required collective decision-making and collective enforcement, because individual farmers had an incentive to graze more animals than their entitlement, and the community had an interest in preventing this. The woodland was the source of fuel and building material and the various other products of trees, nuts and berries, bark for tanning, charcoal for the forge, timber for ploughs and carts and the structures of the village. The rights to use the woodland were also carefully defined. The right to collect fallen wood, the right to take specific quantities of timber for specific purposes, the right to graze pigs in the woodland in autumn to eat the acorns and the beech mast. These rights were managed through the manor court, the local legal institution that handled disputes and enforced the customs of the village, and the record of those disputes tells us, in considerable detail, exactly how seriously medieval farmers took the proper management of the shared resources on which they all depended. Chapter 2. The Plough and the Ploughing. The plough was the most important tool in the medieval farmer's world, the instrument on which the entire system of arable farming depended, and the act of ploughing was the fundamental act of farming, the thing that had to happen before anything else could happen, the preparation of the soil that made sowing possible and harvest likely. Thinking about ploughing in detail, following this process from the beginning of the day to the end, is a very good way to spend the late evening. The heavy mouldboard plough used in much of medieval northern Europe was a substantial piece of equipment. It was drawn by oxen or by horses, typically a team of 4 to 8 animals, because the soil of the open fields was heavy clay that required considerable power to turn. The plough itself consisted of several components. The coulter, which was a vertical blade that cut through the soil ahead of the main ploughshare. The ploughshare itself, which was the horizontal blade that cut beneath the soil to separate it from the ground below. And the mouldboard, which was the curved board behind the ploughshare that turned the cut soil over to one side, burying the surface vegetation and creating the furrow. The whole assembly was mounted on a heavy wooden frame with wheels at the front to control the depth of the ploughing, and it required 2 people to operate, one to lead the animals and one to guide the plough. The person who guided the plough holding the handles and using their weight and their skill to keep the ploughshare at the correct depth and the furrow straight was the ploughman, and the ploughman's skill was one of the most valued agricultural skills in the village. A ploughman who could hold a straight furrow, keeping the line of the cut consistent from one end of the strip to the other, was doing something that looked effortless but was not, requiring continuous small adjustments to the angle and the depth of the plough in response to the varying resistance of the soil, the rocks and roots and changes in texture that presented themselves without warning in the course of a long furrow. The furlong was the standard length of a medieval plough strip, and it was approximately the distance that the ploughing team could travel in one direction before the animals needed to rest. At the end of the furlong, the ploughman would lift the plough from the soil, and the person leading the animals would guide the team in a wide turn, the turn itself requiring a significant length at each end of the strip, which is why the medieval strips were long and narrow rather than square, because a long narrow shape minimized the number of turns required, and therefore the amount of time and energy spent in turning. After the turn, the plough would be set back into the ground and the next furrow begun, running parallel to the previous one, the new furrow gradually building up the ridge of the strip as its soil was turned onto the soil from the previous pass. The pace of the oxen determined the pace of the work, and the pace of the oxen was the pace of large, powerful, slow-moving animals pulling a heavy load through resistant soil. It was not a fast pace, it was a steady, methodical, unhurrying pace. The kind of pace that the field accepted because it had no choice, and that the ploughman accepted because experience had taught that trying to hurry oxen was both futile and exhausting. The oxen moved when they were ready to move, and at the speed they found appropriate, and the ploughman worked with this reality rather than against it. The ploughing day began at dawn and ended at dusk, with a stop at midday for the animals to rest, and for the ploughman and his assistant to eat whatever they had brought with them to the field. The midday rest was genuine rest, the animals standing quietly with their yoke removed, grazing if there was anything to graze on at the headland, and the men sitting or lying on the ground and eating their bread and whatever accompanied it, not hurrying, because the afternoon was as long as the morning, and there was no advantage in rushing back to the work before the rest was complete. The number of acres that a ploughing team could cover in a day was the subject of considerable attention in medieval agricultural writing, and the estimates varied but tended toward something like half an acre to an acre per day on typical soil with a typical team. This seems very slow by modern standards, and it is very slow, and the slowness was simply the reality of what it took to turn heavy clay soil with a team of oxen and a wooden plough, the physics of the task making demands that could not be overridden by any amount of wishing for more speed. Chapter 3. The Farming Year. The medieval farming year was organised by the rhythm of the crops and the animals and the weather, and it had a very clear seasonal structure that made it easy to know, at any point in the year, what work was currently being done and what work was coming next. The familiarity of this structure, year after year and generation after generation, gave the farming life its particular quality of settled continuity, the sense that the work of today was the same work that had been done in this place and at this season for as long as anyone could remember. The farming year in England and in much of northern Europe began in the autumn with the ploughing and sowing of the winter wheat and rye. This was the first ploughing of the year, the preparation of the field for the crops that would be in the ground through the winter, and harvested the following summer. The autumn ploughing was heavy work because the soil had dried and hardened during the summer and needed more effort to break open than the spring soil. The days were shortening and the weather was cooling, and the urgency of getting the winter grain into the ground before the ground became too hard or too wet to work created a particular intensity in the autumn work that the other seasons did not quite have. After the autumn sowing, there was a period of somewhat less intense work, the winter being the season when the land itself rested and the farmer could attend to the maintenance tasks that had been deferred during the busy seasons. The repair of tools and fences and buildings, the management of the livestock that were brought in from the fields, the threshing of the stored grain to separate the wheat from the straw. Winter was not idle, but it was less driven, less organised round a ticking clock of seasonal opportunity, and there was more time in the evenings and on wet days for the indoor work and the social life of the village. Spring began with the ploughing and sowing of the spring crops, oats and barley and peas and beans, which went into the ground as soon as the soil had thawed and dried enough to work. The spring ploughing had a different quality from the autumn ploughing, the soil more cooperative, the air warmer, the days lengthening toward the long light of summer, and there was a quality of renewal and beginning in the spring work that the autumn work, with its orientation toward the approaching darkness, did not have. The summer was the growing season, and the farmer's work during the summer was the work of managing what was growing, weeding the crops, which competed with unwanted plants for the light and the moisture and the nutrients of the soil, managing the fallow field, ploughing it at least once and sometimes twice to control the weeds and prepare it for the following year, and attending to the hay harvest, which was the critical event of early summer that determined whether the animals would have enough to eat through the coming winter. The hay harvest was urgent work because hay needed to be cut at the right stage of growth, when the grass was rich in nutrients but before it had become too coarse, and it needed to be dried and gathered before the weather could damage it. In the unpredictable climate of medieval England, the hay harvest was a race against the rain. The grass cut and spread to dry in the sun, and then raked and turned and raked again, and finally gathered into haycocks and carted to the haystack when it was dry enough not to heat and spoil. A summer with good haymaking weather was a blessing. A summer of rain that kept the hay on the ground and caused it to rot before it could be gathered was a disaster, the consequences reaching all the way to the following spring when the animals' condition would reflect the inadequacy of their winter feed. The grain harvest in late July and August was the culmination of the agricultural year, the moment when the work of the whole previous year was translated into the food that would sustain the community through the following 12 months. The grain harvest was the most labour-intensive operation of the year, and every available person was involved in it. The cutting and binding and stooking and carting and storing of the wheat and rye and oats and barley all happening as quickly as possible before the weather broke. The grain harvest was worked until dark, the reapers moving through the standing grain in long rows, the sickles or scythes cutting the stems close to the ground, the fallen grain gathered into bundles and bound into sheaves, the sheaves set up in groups called stooks to dry before being carted to the threshing floor. The end of the harvest was a moment of relief and celebration, the work done, the grain stored, the immediate future secured. The harvest festival, celebrated in the church and in the village, was a genuine expression of gratitude for a successful harvest, because the people who celebrated it had been genuinely dependent on the outcome and were genuinely relieved that it had gone well. Chapter 4. The Oxen. The oxen deserve a chapter of their own, because the oxen were as central to medieval arable farming as any human member of the community, and their care and management occupied a significant portion of the farmer's attention through every season of the year. Without the oxen, the ploughing could not happen. Without the ploughing, the crops could not grow. Without the crops, the village could not eat. The chain of dependence was as direct as any chain could be, and the well-being of the oxen was not a peripheral concern but a central one. An ox was a castrated bull selected for its size and strength and docile temperament, and trained from a young age to work in harness. The training of a young ox was a gradual process, beginning with teaching the animal to accept the yoke and the pressure of the harness without panicking, then accustoming it to the movement of the plough behind it, and finally building up its strength and its understanding of the ploughman's commands over months and years of increasing work. A fully trained and experienced ox was a valuable animal, representing years of investment in feed and care and training, and the loss of a ploughing ox to illness or injury was a serious blow to the household. The oxen were kept in the byre, which was a low building of stone or timber attached to or near the farmhouse, and their management was a daily responsibility that began each morning before the ploughing started and ended each evening when they had been brought back from the field. In the morning, the oxen were fed their ration of hay and sometimes grain, watered, and groomed before being yoked. The yoke was a wooden bar that rested on the necks of the two animals, held in place by curved wooden bows that passed under their necks and were secured with pins, and the fitting of the yoke was done with care to ensure that it sat correctly and did not cause the animals discomfort that would make them unwilling workers. In the field, the oxen worked steadily through the morning, moving at their deliberate pace up and down the furrows, pausing at the headlands while the plough was turned, resuming when it was set again. The person leading the oxen walked alongside the team, guiding them with verbal commands and sometimes with a goad, which was a long stick used to encourage movement rather than to cause pain, and the skill of the leader was in keeping the animals moving at the right pace without exhausting them, knowing when to pause and when to press on, reading the condition of the animals as the day progressed. At the midday stop, the oxen were unyoked and given time to rest and to drink, and they were inspected for any signs of soreness or lameness that might indicate a problem that needed attention. The feet of working oxen needed to be checked regularly, because a stone lodged in the cleft of the hoof, or a small wound from rough ground, could quickly develop into something more serious if it was not caught early. The oxen were also fitted with iron shoes in some periods and in some areas, which needed to be checked for wear and replaced when they became too thin to protect the hoof. At the end of the working day, the oxen were unyoked, led back to the byre, fed and watered, and settled for the night. The byre in winter was warm with the warmth that large animals generate, and the oxen standing in their stalls, eating steadily from the hay in their mangers, were in their own way content, in the particular way that animals that have been well worked and well fed are content, a state that is not complicated or ambiguous, but is very complete. Chapter 5. The Women of the Farm. The farming household was an economic unit in which every adult member had specific and essential roles, and the women of the farm worked as hard and as continuously as the men in a domain of activity that was equally essential to the household's survival, even if it was less visible in the written records that historians have traditionally relied on. The women's work was largely indoor work in winter, and a combination of indoor and outdoor work in summer, and it included the management of the dairy, the care of the poultry and the pigs, the production of cloth, the preparation of food, the management of the household stores, and the care of the children, all of which were continuous occupations that were always waiting to be attended to. The dairy was one of the most important of the women's domains. The milking of the cows and ewes was a twice daily task, done in the morning before the cows went out to the field and in the evening when they returned, and the milk was then processed into butter and cheese for preservation, because fresh milk did not keep in the unrefrigerated conditions of the medieval farmhouse. The making of butter required churning, which was the process of agitating cream until the fat particles cohered into butter and separated from the buttermilk. The churn was a wooden vessel of various designs, and the churning was done with a plunger that was worked up and down through the cream in a steady rhythmic motion for as long as the butter took to come. This could be considerable time, depending on the temperature of the cream and the design of the churn, and the churning woman would work at it until the change in the sound and the feel of the plunger told her that the butter had come. Cheese-making was a more complex process, involving the curdling of the milk with rennet, which was an enzyme traditionally obtained from the stomach lining of a calf or a kid, and the pressing of the curds to expel the whey and consolidate the cheese. Different cheeses required different treatments. Some were soft and meant to be eaten fresh. Others were hard and meant to be aged for weeks or months, the aging changing their flavour and their keeping qualities. The farm woman who made cheese regularly knew the process in the intimate way of someone who had done it many times, knowing from the feel of the curds and the smell of the process whether things were going as they should and what adjustments needed to be made. The poultry were another area of the farm woman's responsibility. Chickens and geese and ducks were kept in and around the farmyard, fed on grain and on the waste of the household kitchen, and they provided eggs throughout the year and meat at the appropriate seasons. The management of the poultry was not demanding in terms of time, but was continuous in terms of attention. The birds needing to be checked daily for illness, their eggs collected before they could be broken or stolen by foxes, and the condition of their housing monitored to ensure it remained adequate for their welfare. The vegetable garden, called the toft, was the farm woman's domain, a small enclosed area close to the house where vegetables and herbs were grown for the household's immediate use. The garden produced onions and leeks and cabbages and various root vegetables, the herbs used in cooking and in medicine, and sometimes fruit from trees planted at the garden's edge. The care of the garden was done in the spare moments between other tasks, a little weeding when there was time, some watering in dry weather, the harvest of whatever was ready, the planting of new seeds when the season allowed. The garden was not a formal or impressive space, but it was a productive one, and the food it produced made a genuine contribution to the variety and the nutritional quality of the household's diet. Chapter 6. The Manor and its Obligations. The medieval farmer did not farm their land in complete independence. They farmed it within a structure of obligation and tenure that defined their relationship to the lord of the manor and to the other members of the village community, and the management of these obligations was as much a part of the farming life as the management of the crops and the animals. The manor was the basic unit of lordship in medieval England, an estate under the control of a single lord who held it from a higher lord or directly from the king, and who in return for his tenure owed military and other services to the person above him in the feudal hierarchy. The tenants of the manor, the farmers who held their strips in the open fields and their cottages in the village, owed various obligations to the lord in return for their tenure, obligations that were specified by the custom of the manor and enforced by the manor court.
The most onerous of these obligations for the villains who were the
unfree tenants of the manor was the labour service. Villains were required to work on the lord's domain, which was the part of the manor that the lord farmed directly, for a specified number of days per week throughout the year, and for additional days during the busy seasons of ploughing and harvest. A typical labour service obligation might require a villain to work 2 or 3 days per week on the lord's domain, with additional work at specified points in the agricultural calendar, so that a significant fraction of the villain's available working time was owed to the lord rather than available for work on their own holding. The administration of the labour service was managed by the reeve, who was an elected officer of the village, typically one of the more substantial villain tenants, who organised the labour services owed by the other tenants, and ensured that the lord's domain was properly worked. The reeve was a position of real responsibility and real difficulty because the reeve was accountable to the lord for the performance of the domain, and to the tenants for the fair distribution of the obligations, and these two accountabilities did not always point in the same direction. The manor court was the legal institution through which the lord's jurisdiction over the manor was exercised. It met regularly, typically several times a year, and handled the full range of legal matters that arose in the life of the village: the transfer of land between tenants, the admission of new tenants, the resolution of disputes between neighbours about the boundaries of strips or the management of common resources, the presentment of offences against the customary rules of the village, and the enforcement of the lord's rights. The records of the manor court, called the court rolls, survive in large numbers from the 13th century onwards, and are among the most detailed sources of information about the daily life of medieval farming communities that historians have. The free tenants of the manor held their land in a different legal relationship from the villeins, owing money rents and specified services rather than the open-ended labour services of villein tenure, and having access to the royal courts for the resolution of disputes, rather than being confined to the manor court. The distinction between free and unfree tenure was one of the most significant social distinctions of medieval rural life, though it was not always a distinction of practical well-being. A free tenant with a small holding might be considerably less comfortable than a villein with a large one. Chapter 7. Sowing the Seed. The sowing of the seed was one of the most skilled of the farming operations because the quantity of seed sown per acre and the evenness of its distribution had direct consequences for the density and the evenness of the crop that grew from it, and a crop that was too thin or too uneven produced less grain than a properly sown field. The sower walked through the ploughed field with a bag or a basket of seed, casting the seed in a wide arc with each stride, the seed spreading in a fan-shaped pattern that, when repeated stride after stride across the field, should produce an even distribution of seeds across the whole surface. The casting motion of the sower was a specific skill that needed to be learned and that, once learned, became as automatic as walking. The arm swung from the shoulder in a controlled arc, the hand releasing the seed at the right moment in the swing to produce the desired spread, the pace of the walk and the rate of the arm swing calibrated to produce a consistent distribution. A good sower produced a field where every part received the right amount of seed and no part was overseeded or underseeded. A poor sower produced patches of thick growth and patches of thin growth, a field that was harder to manage and that ultimately yielded less. The seed itself was precious. It was the portion of the previous year's harvest set aside for sowing, the investment that would produce the next harvest, and the quantity available for sowing was limited by the need to keep enough for eating and for selling. The proportion of the harvest set aside for seed varied by crop, but was typically something between 1/5 and 1/4 of the total yield, and the calculation of how much to keep for seed and how much was available for other purposes was one of the first and most important decisions of the post-harvest period. After the seed was sown, it needed to be covered, which was done by harrowing, pulling a heavy wooden frame with iron or wooden tines across the surface of the field to break up any remaining clods, and to draw a thin layer of soil over the seeds. The harrow was drawn by a horse or by oxen, moved back and forth across the field in a pattern that ensured all of the surface was covered, and the harrowing was often the last operation before the field was left for the seed to germinate and the crop to emerge. The waiting period after sowing, when the seed was in the ground and the farmer could do nothing about it except watch for the first green signs of germination, was one of the intervals in the farming year when the pace of work was necessarily relaxed. The soil was doing its own work, the seeds responding to the warmth and the moisture, the roots and the shoots of each plant extending invisibly through the darkness of the soil, and the farmer could only wait and observe and hope that the weather would cooperate. This period of waiting, which was not passive but was a different kind of attention from the active labour of ploughing and sowing, had its own quality, a watchful patience that the farmer developed over years of experiencing the gap between sowing and germination, and learning to trust the process. Chapter 8. The Harvest. The harvest was the culmination of the farming year, the event that everything else had been pointing toward, and it was the most intense and the most communal of all the farming operations. For the duration of the harvest, the normal patterns of the working day were suspended in favour of a single urgent focus, getting the ripe grain cut and stored before the weather could damage it. The harvest occupied all available labour, men, women, and older children working alongside each other in the field from early morning until darkness made work impossible, and the pace and the effort were sustained at a level that was not maintained at any other time of year. The reaping of the grain was done with a sickle, which was the most common harvest tool in the medieval period, a short-handled tool with a curved blade that the reaper used to cut a handful of grain stalks at a time, drawing the blade through the stalks close to the ground. The reaper worked in a crouching or bent position, which was physically demanding through a long day, cutting a swathe through the standing grain and leaving the cut grain lying behind them. The reaper's hands became calloused and sometimes cut from the sharp edges of the grain stalks over the course of the harvest, a minor and expected discomfort of the work. In some areas and some periods, the scythe was used instead of or alongside the sickle. The scythe was a long-handled tool that allowed the reaper to cut while standing upright, swinging the blade through the grain in a wide sweeping arc. The scythe was faster than the sickle, but required more skill to use effectively, and was more likely to scatter the grain if used carelessly, so its adoption was not universal, and the two tools coexisted in different regions according to local practice and tradition. Behind the reapers came the binders, who gathered the cut grain into bundles of the right size for a sheaf, and tied each bundle with a twist of straw, the tying being done with a practised motion that secured the bundle firmly without requiring separate binding material. The sheaves were then set up in groups of several, leaning against each other with the ears of grain pointing upward to form a stook. The stook allowed air to circulate around the grain as it dried, and the grain needed to be dry enough before it was carted away that it would not heat and spoil in the stack. How long the grain stayed in stook depended on the weather. A dry, sunny week after the reaping and the grain would be ready to cart. A week of rain, and the process was delayed, the stooks standing in the field while the farmer waited anxiously for the weather to improve. The carting of the grain from the field to the stackyard or the threshing floor was done with carts and wagons drawn by horses or oxen, and it required several people working together, the loaders on the ground lifting the sheaves up to the person on the cart who arranged them in the correct pattern to build a stable load. The carts moved between the field and the farmyard in a steady procession when the weather was good and the grain was ready, and the unloading of each cart and the building of the stack or the rick in the farmyard was as skilled an operation as the loading, because a stack that was not correctly built could collapse or could admit water that would spoil the grain. When the last load had been brought in and the field was clear of sheaves, the gleaning could begin. Gleaning was the customary right of the poor to go through the harvested field and pick up the ears of grain that had been missed by the reapers or had fallen from the sheaves during the carting. It was a recognized right, enforced by custom if not always by law, and the gleaners who moved through the harvested field after the main harvest, working carefully through the stubble, were adding a small but real supplement to their household's grain supply from the margins of other people's harvest. Chapter 9. The Threshing Floor. The threshing floor was the large flat surface usually paved with stone or with beaten earth, where the threshing was done, the separation of the grain from the straw by beating. The grain could not be stored in the sheaf indefinitely, and the threshing had to be done to make the grain available for milling and for selling, but it was not done all at once. Threshing was a winter task, spread through the months from harvest to spring, the sheaves brought from the stack a few at a time and threshed in batches as the grain was needed. Threshing was done with a flail, which was a simple but effective tool consisting of 2 wooden sticks connected end to end by a short length of leather or cord, one stick being the handle and the other, shorter one being the beater. The thresher held the handle and swung the beater down onto the sheaves of grain laid on the threshing floor, the impact of the beater on the straw causing the grain to separate from the ears and fall to the floor. The rhythm of flail threshing was a steady 2-beat rhythm, the arm raising and the beater descending one stroke after another, hour after hour, with the thresher moving around the spread sheaves to ensure that all of them were struck evenly. When the threshing was done, the floor was covered with a mixture of grain and straw and chaff, and these needed to be separated from each other. The straw, which was the long stalks of the grain without the ears, was raked aside and kept for animal bedding and for thatching. The grain and the chaff, which was the dried husks of the grain, needed to be winnowed, which was the process of separating the grain from the lighter chaff by exploiting their different weights. Winnowing was done by scooping up a quantity of the grain and chaff mixture and pouring it from a height, either from a shovel or from a wooden flat basket called a winnowing fan, into the wind or the draught, which carried the light chaff away while the heavier grain fell more directly downward onto a clean sheet or into a trough. Winnowing required a wind of the right strength, strong enough to carry the chaff away but not so strong that it carried the grain with it, and the winnower adjusted their technique to the strength of the wind, raising or lowering the height from which they poured and adjusting the angle of their body to the wind accordingly. The grain left on the threshing floor after winnowing was relatively clean, but not perfectly so, and it was often passed through a sieve or a riddle to remove any remaining pieces of straw or chaff before it was stored in the grain bin or taken to the mill for grinding. The grain bin was a wooden chest with a tightly fitting lid to keep out moisture and vermin, and the grain was poured into it in layers, the layers turned periodically to prevent the development of hot spots that would cause the grain to spoil. The management of the grain in the bin through the winter, checking it regularly for signs of deterioration, turning it to ensure even drying, keeping the bin tight against the weather and the mice, was a continuous background task that required no great effort but did require reliable attention. Chapter 10. The Mill. Every village of any size had a mill, or shared a mill with neighbouring villages, because grain needed to be ground into flour before it could be made into bread, and grinding grain on a hand quern was slow and exhausting, and the watermill or the windmill could do the same work in a fraction of the time and with a fraction of the effort. The miller was therefore a figure of real importance in the rural community, the person through whom the village's grain was transformed into the flour that became the bread that kept everyone alive. The farmer who brought grain to the mill was entering into a transaction that was carefully regulated and about which considerable suspicion existed in the popular imagination. the miller took a portion of the grain as payment for the milling, a toll called the multure, and the measurement of the multure was a point of potential dispute because the miller had both the opportunity and, allegedly, the inclination to take more than the agreed share. Medieval literature about millers is not flattering, and the miller of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the Reeve's Tale, and various other texts is characteristically portrayed as dishonest and greedy. Whether real millers were generally as bad as their literary reputation suggests is another question, but the reputation itself tells us that the relationship between farmer and miller was one in which trust was not assumed. The waiting time at the mill was built into the farmer's day. The mill did not run continuously. It ran when there was water or wind to drive it and grain waiting to be ground. And when multiple farmers arrived on the same day, there was a queue, and the farmer who had arrived early had their grain ground before the farmer who arrived later. The queue at the mill was therefore, among other things, a social occasion, a place where farmers who had been out in their separate fields met each other and could talk, and the conversation of the mill queue covered the same range of topics as any gathering of people who shared the same concerns and the same landscape, the state of the crops, the behaviour of the animals, the weather, the latest news from the manor court, and whatever had happened in the village since they had last had occasion to talk at length. The miller managed the mill and its mechanical components, maintaining the millstones and the gearing and the water wheel or the sails, because a mill that stopped working was a mill that could not grind, and a miller whose mill was not working had no income and a queue of angry farmers. The maintenance of the mill was therefore a continuous responsibility, the miller checking the condition of the millstones and dressing them when their grinding surfaces had worn smooth, maintaining the wooden gearing and the wheel, managing the sluice that controlled the flow of water to the water wheel. The miller who kept the mill in good working order and ground the grain honestly was a valued member of the community. The miller who let the mill fall into disrepair or who cheated on the multure became the subject of exactly the kind of stories that Chaucer recorded. Chapter 11. Animals and the Farming Year. We have discussed the oxen already, but the farming household kept a range of animals beyond the ploughing oxen, and each of these animals had its own contribution to the household economy and its own management requirements through the year. The relationship between the farmer and the farm animals was as central to the farming life as the relationship between the farmer and the soil, and the two were deeply intertwined because the animals provided the fertilizer that kept the soil productive, and the soil produced the feed that kept the animals alive. Cows and other cattle were kept primarily for their milk and for their labour, the oxen for ploughing and the cows for dairying, and their meat was a secondary product that became available when an animal was slaughtered at the end of its useful life, or when the winter feed ran short and a hard choice had to be made. The management of the dairy cattle through the year followed the natural cycle of calving and lactation, the cows producing milk from shortly after calving in the spring through to late autumn, when the milk supply naturally diminished. During the lactating months, the morning milking and the evening milking were fixtures of the farmer's wife's daily routine, the milk carried to the dairy and processed before it could spoil. Sheep were kept for their wool, and for their milk, and for their meat, and they could graze on land that was not suitable for cattle or for cultivation, making them a useful complement to the arable farming. The sheep's wool was shorn once a year in late spring, a process that was usually done communally in some villages, the neighbours helping each other with the clipping and the shearing, the work going faster with many hands than one family could manage alone. The fleeces were sold to wool merchants or kept for spinning within the household, and in either case represented a significant part of the household's annual income. Pigs were kept by most households that could keep them, because pigs were efficient converters of waste food and scraps into meat and fat, requiring little investment of good grain while producing a product of considerable value. Pig keeping as a village was subject to regulation, as we mentioned in an earlier story about medieval laws, because pigs allowed to wander caused problems, and the management of the village's pig population was an ongoing concern for the manor court. The pigs of each household were typically kept in an enclosed space near the house and fed on the kitchen scraps and the whey from the dairy and whatever else was available that the pigs would eat, which was a great deal because pigs are not particular. The autumn slaughter was the major annual event in the management of the pig and the other livestock that were not going to be kept through the winter. The decision about which animals to keep and which to slaughter was made in the autumn, based on the quality of the animal, its likely value in future years, and the quantity of winter feed available. An animal that was likely to produce a good return in future, but whose winter feeding would strain the household's feed supplies, was a difficult case. The decision to slaughter a potentially productive animal now to conserve resources was a real sacrifice that the farmer made with full understanding of its implications. The preserved meat from the autumn slaughter, the salted and smoked bacon and the salted beef and the various other forms in which meat could be kept through the winter, was stored in the farmhouse and drawn on through the cold months, providing the primary source of dietary protein at the time of year when fresh food was least available. The careful management of these reserves, ensuring they were properly preserved and keeping track of how much remained relative to how much of the winter was still to come, was another of the ongoing background tasks of the winter household. Chapter 12. The Alewife and the Brew. House ale was the primary drink of medieval England, consumed by every member of the population from the most exalted to the most humble, because ale was safe to drink in a way that water was not always safe, because it provided calories in a form that supplemented the cereal-heavy diet, and because it was made from grain, which the farming community had in abundance. The brewing of ale was therefore a regular domestic activity in most farming households, and the person who managed the brewing was typically the woman of the household, though in some villages brewing had evolved into a more commercial activity with dedicated alewives who brewed for sale as well as for their own household. The brewing of ale in the medieval period was a different process from modern beer making in some significant ways. Medieval ale was made without hops, which were not widely used in England until the 15th century, and whose preservative and flavouring qualities changed the character of the drink considerably. Without hops, medieval ale was sweeter and less bitter than modern beer, and it did not keep as long, typically being at its best within a few days of brewing and becoming undrinkable within a week or two. This limited keeping quality meant that ale had to be brewed regularly, typically every few days or once a week, rather than in large batches that could be stored for extended periods. The brewing began with malting, which was the process of germinating barley and then killing the germination with heat, which activated the enzymes in the grain that would later convert the starch of the grain into the sugars that the yeast needed for fermentation. Malting required soaking the grain in water for a day or two, then spreading it on the floor to germinate for several days, turning it regularly to prevent it from heating unevenly and to ensure all the grains germinated at approximately the same rate, and then drying it in a kiln. The dried malt was then ground in the andquern and mashed in hot water to extract the sugars, producing a sweet liquid called the wort that was the raw material for fermentation. The wort was cooled and the yeast was added, the yeast being saved from the previous brewing as a small quantity of the finished ale, or as a culture maintained specifically for the purpose. The fermentation proceeded over several days, the yeast consuming the sugars and producing alcohol and carbon dioxide, the ale gradually taking on its characteristic flavour and strength. When the fermentation was complete, the ale was ready to drink and was transferred to barrels or jugs for serving. The alewife who brewed commercially sold her ale from her house, announcing its availability by hanging an ale stake, which was a pole with a bush of greenery tied to it, outside her door, a signal understood throughout the village that fresh ale was available. The quality and the price of the ale were regulated by the assize of ale, which we have mentioned in an earlier story, and the ale taster who checked compliance with the assize would visit the alewife and sample her product, and check the measure of the vessel she used for selling, ensuring that the ale was of the specified quality and the measure was honest. Chapter 13. The Common Herd and the Shepherd. The management of the village's grazing animals was organised communally, with the animals of all the households in the village put together into a common herd or flock, and managed by a shared herdsman or shepherd paid by the village. This communal arrangement was practical because it allowed the animals to be managed more efficiently than they could have been in separate household flocks, and it freed the individual farmers from the daily task of watching their own animals, allowing them to attend to other work. The common herd was assembled each morning at a central point in the village, typically the green or a designated gathering place near the edge of the settlement, where the animals from each household were brought and joined with the others. The herdsman then took charge of the assembled animals and drove them to the appropriate grazing area for the day, the commons or the fallow field or the meadow after the hay had been cut, whichever was available and appropriate for the season. The shepherd who managed the sheep had a particularly close relationship with his flock, moving with them through the day and knowing each animal individually in the way that a person who spends every day with the same animals comes to know them, recognizing the ones that were prone to straying and the ones that needed extra attention at lambing time, and the ones that were the leaders whose movement influenced the movement of the whole flock. The shepherd's year was organised around the sheep's year, lambing in early spring being the most demanding period, when the shepherd was present with the flock through the nights as well as the days, assisting with difficult births and ensuring that the lambs received adequate attention from their mothers and did not die in the cold. The lambing period was the most anxious time of the shepherd's year, the hours of darkness spent in the lambing field or the lambing shed, checking the ewes regularly by lamplight, intervening when an ewe seemed in difficulty, warming a chilled lamb, or helping a newborn lamb find its mother's milk. The losses at lambing time were part of the reality of sheep farming in the medieval period, not every lamb surviving to weaning, and the shepherd who kept the losses low was considered skilled and was valued accordingly. After lambing, the sheep moved through the summer on the commons and the fallow fields, fattening on the summer grass, their wool growing through the months toward the shearing in late spring. The shepherd moved with them, watching for the signs of disease and parasites that were the constant hazards of sheep farming, separating sick animals from the flock, treating what could be treated, managing the movement of the flock to prevent overgrazing of any one area. In the evenings, the shepherd brought the flock back to the fold, which was an enclosed area where they spent the night, safe from the foxes and the wolves that were the predators of medieval sheep, and from which they could be moved to the arable fields to graze and to dung the fallow. Chapter 14. The Peasant's House. We have talked about the fields and the work done in them at considerable length, and it is time to turn to the house where the farming family lived, because the house was as much a part of the farming life as the field, and the interior of the peasant's house, described carefully and without hurry, is exactly the kind of material that makes the mind want to settle. The peasant's house in medieval England varied considerably in its quality and its size depending on the wealth and the status of the household. But a typical house of a substantial villan tenant was a rectangular building of 1 or 2 rooms, with walls of timber frame filled with wattle and daub or with mud, a thatched roof and an earthen floor. The building was low, the eaves close to the ground, the ceilings barely clearing the heads of the tallest members of the household, and the interior was dim even on bright days because the windows, such as they were small and covered with oiled cloth or animal membrane rather than glass. The hearth was in the centre of the main room, an open fire on a clay or stone base, the smoke rising through a hole in the roof or finding its way out through the thatch, which was porous enough to let smoke through, even if it was not entirely satisfactory in its management of the smoke. The fire was kept going more or less continuously, banked at night, and built up again in the morning, the coals preserved from one day to the next, so that the laborious process of making fire from scratch was not often required. The fire provided warmth in winter and cooking heat year-round, and its management was the central domestic task of every day. The furniture of the peasant's house was simple and limited. There was a table, typically a board placed on trestles that could be assembled when needed and stored against the wall when not in use. There were benches for sitting. There was a coffer or a chest for storing the household's valuables and its best clothes. There were hooks or pegs on the walls for hanging tools and garments. There was a sleeping area at one end of the main room or in a separate small room, with a straw pallet or a wooden bed frame with a straw or wool mattress, covered with whatever wool blankets and wool clothing the household had accumulated. The smells of the peasant's house were the smells of the fire and the cooking and the animals and the people who lived in it, a complex combination that was entirely familiar to its inhabitants, and that was simply the smell of home. The sound of the house at night was the sound of the fire's slow breathing and the animals in the byre, audible through the shared wall if the byre was attached to the house, which in many cases it was, the animal warmth being a useful supplement to the warmth of the fire on cold nights. Chapter 15. The End of the Day and the Beginning of the Night. Let us come now to the end of the day in the medieval farming household, because the end of the day is where this story has been moving, steadily and without urgency, through all the chapters of the field and the hearth and the animals and the mill and the seasons. The farming day ended when the light ended, because there was no adequate artificial light for outdoor work, and the indoor work by firelight and lamplight was limited in its scope and its visibility. The family that had been out in the fields since early morning began to come together as the light faded, the ploughman returning the oxen to the byre and then coming into the house, the shepherd bringing the flock back to the fold and then coming in, the farm wife who had been tending the animals and the garden and the dairy and the kitchen coming to the end of the day's outdoor work and turning to the preparation of the evening meal. The evening meal was the day's most substantial meal, eaten together by the household around the fire or at the assembled trestle table, the food plain and filling, a pottage of vegetables and perhaps some meat, thick with grain or legumes, bread to accompany it, ale to drink. The pottage was the basic food of the medieval peasant, a thick soup or stew made from whatever was available, the basis of which was almost always some form of grain or legume, and the flavouring of which was whatever herbs the garden and the commons provided. It was not elaborate food, and it was not varied food by the standards of a modern diet, but it was warm and it was filling, and it was exactly what a body needed at the end of a long day of physical work, and the family that sat together eating it in the firelight had worked for it, and knew it, and ate it accordingly. After the meal, the evening was short. The fire was still giving light and warmth, but the darkness outside and the tiredness of the working day made extended wakefulness unusual and unnecessary. There might be some small indoor work done by firelight, the women spinning or mending, the men repairing a tool or sharpening the sickle for tomorrow's work, the children already asleep on their pallet in the corner. There might be a brief exchange of news with a neighbour who had come in, or a song, or the telling of a story that everyone in the room had heard many times before, but that was no less welcome for its familiarity. And then the fire was banked, and the lamp extinguished, and the household arranged itself for sleep, the adults and the older children on the sleeping platform or the bed, covered with whatever was available, the fire giving off the faint glow of the banked coals, the byre next door providing its background warmth and its low continuous sounds, the outside dark and quiet and cold. The farmer who lay down at the end of that day had ploughed or harrowed or sowed or weeded or reaped or threshed, had fed the oxen and milked the cows and managed the pigs, had eaten the same food as the day before and the day before that, had talked to the same people and done the same work in the same place, and would do it all again tomorrow. There was nothing in this that was remarkable. It was simply the day. Tomorrow it would be the day again, in the same form, with the same requirements and the same ordinary satisfactions, and the sleep that came to the farmer at the end of this day was the sleep that deep physical tiredness produces, not complicated or shallow or interrupted by racing thoughts, just the straightforward descent into rest that a body which has done a full day's work in the open air requires and receives without difficulty. You may not have been ploughing or reaping today, but the descent into rest is the same descent, and the dark that receives you is the same dark that received the medieval farmer, and the sleep that comes is the same sleep, the simple biological necessity that the body claims at the end of the day, and that no amount of modernity has changed. The fire is banked, the oxen are settled in the byre, the grain is in the stack, the seed is in the ground, the work is done. Good night. Extended reflections, the long pattern of the agricultural year, For those still present with us in the late evening, here are some further thoughts on the agricultural year and on what it felt like to live inside a cycle that repeated itself so completely from one year to the next. One of the things that is most striking about the medieval farming year, when you consider it carefully, is how completely it was determined by forces outside any individual's control. The weather could not be managed. The fertility of the soil could be influenced but not commanded. The growth of the crops followed its own schedule, timed by the temperature and the moisture and the length of the days, not by the farmer's preferences. The farmer could do all the right things at all the right times and still have a bad harvest if the summer was wet or the winter grain was killed by frost. The best a farmer could do was to work as well as possible within the conditions that the season provided, and to accept the outcome as what the conditions allowed. This acceptance of the conditions was not fatalism, it was realism. The farmer who understood the limits of what human effort could achieve as a face of weather and soil and season was the farmer who could work effectively within those limits, not exhausting themselves against what could not be changed, and not despairing when things went wrong for reasons that were not their fault. The medieval farming community was composed of people who had lived with this reality for generations, and who had developed, through that long exposure, an attitude toward it that was practical and steady. The concept of the good year and the bad year was one that medieval farmers understood thoroughly. There were years when the harvest was heavy, and the hay was made without a drop of rain, and the animals came through the winter in good condition, and the spring ploughing went well, and everything worked as it was supposed to work. And there were years when the spring was cold and late, and the crops were thin, or the summer was wet and the hay was ruined, or the autumn storms came too early and damaged the standing grain before it could be reaped. The good years were appreciated precisely because the bad years were known, the abundance of a good harvest more vivid against the background of knowing what a failed harvest meant. The rhythm of the year was also a rhythm of human connection, because the major agricultural operations were communal. The ploughing, the harrowing, the hay harvest, the grain harvest, the autumn slaughter, the threshing. All of these involved more than one family working together, helping each other, sharing the work and the conversation and the shared meals of the long working days. The farming community was a community of people who depended on each other in the most literal way, whose daily lives were intertwined by the practical requirements of an agricultural system that required more than any single household could provide. This intertwining was the social fabric of the village. The neighbour who helped with the harvest this year was the neighbour whose harvest you would help with next year. The shared work created obligations and relationships that lasted for generations. The memory of mutual assistance passing down through families as surely as the knowledge of the soil and the crops. The village was not a collection of isolated households, but a web of ongoing reciprocal relationships, sustained by the practical necessity of cooperation, and deepened by the familiarity of long acquaintance. And now it is late, and the fields are dark, and the farming village is long past, its people in the ground, and its strips faded into the landscape. The ridge and furrow still visible in some places if you know what you are looking for, the patient undulations of the old ploughing, preserved in the earth for centuries after the ploughman and the oxen are gone. The grain that was grown in those fields has been eaten, and the eating of it is part of everything that has happened since, and the work that produced it as dissolved into time as all work eventually does, leaving behind only the faint impression of the furrow in the surviving grass. It is a quiet thing to contemplate. The field is still, the furrows are still, the season is resting between one year and the next, and you are resting too, in the dark of a night that is part of the same long sequence of nights that has followed every day since days began. The same dark, the same quiet, the same deep and patient rest that comes at the end of every working day and takes everything into itself and holds it until morning. Let it hold you. The field is waiting for morning. You are waiting for morning. The waiting is sleep. Good night. 1. Final note. What the soil remembers. There is one last thing for those who have come all this way with the medieval farmer through the ploughing and the sowing and the harvesting and the long winter evenings by the fire. The soil of a field that has been farmed for centuries is different from soil that has not been farmed, in ways that can be detected by analysis and that tell the story of the farming that happened there. The centuries of ploughing and manuring and planting and harvesting have changed the chemistry and the structure of the soil, and this change persists long after the farming has stopped, the soil carrying in itself the record of what was done to it and what was grown in it, the accumulated consequence of generations of agricultural decisions. In this sense, the medieval farmer is still present in the soil of the fields they worked, not in any mystical sense, but in the straightforward material sense that their actions changed the physical composition of something that still exists, and that the change they made is still there, still detectable, still part of what the soil is. The ploughman who turned the same strip every autumn for 30 years left an impression in the soil that outlasted them by centuries. The farmer who spread their dung on the same field year after year changed the chemistry of that field in a way that is still measurable. This is not a dramatic thought. It is a quiet one, which is why it belongs here at the end of this story. The medieval farmer's life was not dramatic. It was quiet and repetitive and organized around the most basic of human needs and the most basic of human pleasures, the warmth of the fire and the satisfaction of the harvest and the rest of the long winter evening. And the trace they left in the world is a quiet trace, pressed into the soil of the fields they worked, readable only to those who know how to read it. You're also leaving a quiet trace in the world, and you will also be readable to those who know how to read it, and the reading will not happen tonight. Tonight there is only the rest, the warm dark, the end of the day, the beginning of the sleep. The soil is quiet, the fields are still, the oxen are in the byre, the fire is banked, the pottage is eaten, and the bowls are put away. The grain is stored. Everything is ready for tomorrow, which is a long way away. Tonight there is only this. Good night. Sleep well. The dark is here. The rest is here. Everything is as it should be. Chapter 16. Hedgerows and Boundaries. The boundaries of the medieval farmer's world were not abstract lines on a map, but physical features in the landscape, and the maintenance of those features was part of the ongoing work of the farming year. The hedgerows that separated one holding from another, the ditches that drained the fields and marked their edges, the fences and the hurdles that enclosed the livestock, the walls of the farmyard and the garden. All of these physical boundaries required regular attention and occasional substantial repair, and the work of maintaining them was a background obligation that ran through every season. The hedgerow was the most characteristic of the English boundary features, a dense planting of thorny shrubs along the edge of a field or a lane that, when properly managed, was as effective as any fence at containing animals and as permanent as any wall. The primary shrub used in hedgerows was hawthorn, sometimes called quickthorn, and it was planted as a hedge by setting small-rooted plants close together in a line and allowing them to grow until they were tall enough and dense enough to be laid, which was the operation that transformed a row of upright shrubs into a proper hedge. Hedge laying was a skilled operation, done in winter when the sap was down and the shrubs were dormant, in which the main stems of the hawthorn plants were partially cut through near their bases and then bent over at a low angle, the cut not going all the way through so that the stem remained alive and continued to grow. The bent stems were woven through a series of upright stakes driven into the ground at regular intervals along the hedge line, the whole being held together by bindings of flexible wood twisted along the top. The laid hedge, looking in winter like a neat but somewhat skeletal structure of interwoven stems and stakes, would in the following spring and summer put out vigorous new growth from all the laid stems, growing upward from the bent main stem in a way that rapidly produced a dense and bushy growth. A well-laid hedge, maintained by laying every 10 to 15 years, would last for generations, becoming thicker and more impenetrable with each cycle, and the hedges of the English countryside that survive today, some of which are hundreds of years old, are the direct descendants of the hedgerows laid by medieval farmers. The drainage ditches that ran along the edges of the open field strips and through the meadows and the commons needed to be cleaned out periodically to keep them effective. A ditch that was not cleaned out would gradually fill with silt, and with the decaying vegetation that fell into it from the edges becoming shallower and less effective until it no longer drained the ground beside it and the field began to waterlog. The cleaning of ditches was a regular autumn and winter task, the ditch cleaner working along the length of the ditch with a spade, removing the accumulated material and throwing it up onto the bank beside the ditch, which built up the bank over time and improved the drainage. The work was wet and cold and not particularly skilled, but it was important, and the condition of the drainage was visible in the condition of the fields above it, the poorly drained strip standing out from its neighbours as a patch of darker, waterlogged soil that produced less grain and was harder to work. The gates of the field system were simple structures of wood, hung on wooden or stone posts, and they needed to be maintained to ensure they could be opened and closed reliably, because a gate that would not close properly was a gate that would let the animals out of wherever they were supposed to be, which was always a problem. The hinges and the fastenings of medieval farm gates were simple, dependent on the straightness of the wooden bar and the soundness of the post, and the maintenance of this simplicity required occasional replacement of posts that had rotted and bars that had warped, done with the same methodical attention that all farm maintenance was done. Chapter 17. The Village Green and the Common Life. The village green was the social centre of the medieval farming community, the open space in the heart of the settlement around which the houses and the church were arranged, where the common herd assembled in the morning and where the communal life of the village was conducted. The green was a public space in the fullest sense, belonging to no one household but to the community as a whole, used for a range of activities that reflected the social and the practical dimensions of village life. The market, in villages that had the right to hold one was sometimes held on the green, the traders setting up their stalls around the open space, and the villagers and visitors from the surrounding area moving among them. The market green on market day had a different quality from the market green on an ordinary day. The usual quiet of the space replaced by the sounds and the movement of trade, and then restored to quiet again when the market was over, and the stalls were taken down and the green was just the green again. The sports and games of the village were played on the green, the ball games and the wrestling and the archery practice that the parish priest, and sometimes the law required of the able-bodied men, and the simpler games of the children who used the open space as a playground in the way that children always use available open spaces. The green on a Sunday afternoon or a feast day, when the work stopped and the village had time for recreation, was a livelier place than it was on working days. The sound of people at leisure carrying through, the settlement in a way that the sounds of work did not quite. The church stood at or near the green in most English villages, and the church was the other centre of communal life, the place where the whole village gathered weekly, and on the feast days of the liturgical calendar, where the major events of individual lives, the baptisms and the marriages and the burials, were marked in the presence of the community. The churchyard was the burial ground, and was also, in some periods and some places, the site of trade and of social gathering after services, the space between the church building and the churchyard wall serving as a kind of additional green where people could stand and talk before dispersing to their homes. The relationship between the church and the farming community was one of mutual dependence and occasional friction. The church required tithes, a tenth of the agricultural produce of each household, paid in kind rather than in money, the sheaves of grain stacked in the tithe barn and the animals of the tithe flock assembled in the tithe fold, the priest's share of the community's productive effort made visible in these accumulations of physical produce. The tithe was a genuine burden on the farming household, a tenth of what had been grown and raised removed from the household's control before it could be used or sold, and the resentment that tithes generated was real and occasionally expressed in the evasions and the disputes that the church courts had to handle. But the church was also the community's principal source of education and of comfort, and of the framework of meaning within which the difficulties and the uncertainties of the farming life were interpreted, and the relationship, for all its tensions, was one of deep integration rather than simple opposition. Chapter 18. The Manor Court and Village Governance. The Manor Court was the legal and administrative institution through which the everyday life of the farming village was governed, and understanding how it worked is important for understanding how the medieval farming community managed its own affairs and resolved its own disputes. The manor court met several times a year at a regular interval, typically every 3 weeks in larger manors and less frequently in smaller ones, and it was attended by all the free and unfree tenants of the manor, who were required to come whether they had business before the court or not, because their presence was part of their obligation to the Lord and to the community. The court was presided over by the Lord Steward or by a deputy, and the business was conducted in the presence of the assembled tenants, who both witnessed the proceedings and participated in the judgment of cases. The range of business handled by the manor court was very broad. Land transfers were recorded in the court roll. the outgoing tenant surrendering their land into the Lord's hands and the incoming tenant receiving it, the whole transaction witnessed by the court and recorded in the roll, which served as the official record of who held what. The admission of new tenants, the inheritance of holdings by the children of deceased tenants, and the division of holdings when a tenant died without a direct heir were all handled through the court. Disputes between tenants were also heard by the court. A tenant who complained that a neighbour had ploughed into their strip or had allowed their animals to stray into a field where they were not supposed to be, or had failed to maintain their section of a shared ditch, brought their complaint before the court, and the court heard both sides and made a judgment. The judgments of the court were enforceable, backed by the Lord's authority and by the collective weight of the community's presence, and the tenant who ignored a court judgment could be fined or could lose their holding. The court also enforced the customary regulations of the village, the rules about the management of the commons and the timing of the harvest and the behaviour expected of tenants in relation to each other and to the Lord. A tenant who grazed more animals than their entitlement on the commons was presented before the court and fined. A tenant who obstructed a right-of-way was similarly dealt with. A tenant who brewed ale without the proper licence, or who sold ale in incorrect measures, was presented by the ale tasters and fined. The court was the mechanism by which the community's self-regulation was enforced, and it met regularly enough and dealt with enough cases that the threat of presentment was a genuine constraint on behaviour. The records of the manor court, the rolls on which the proceedings were recorded, are among the most detailed and the most revealing sources of information about medieval village life that survive. Reading through the court rolls of a particular manor for a period of years, you can follow the lives of individual tenants as they appear in the records, buying and selling land, having disputes with their neighbours, inheriting holdings from their parents, falling into debt, marrying their children into other families, growing old and eventually dying and being replaced in the record by their heirs. The lives recorded in the court rolls are ordinary lives, lives that were not remarkable enough to be remembered in any other way, and the ordinariness of them is part of what makes them so absorbing to read and so apt for the purpose of this story. Chapter 19. Winter Tasks. We have described the winter as a quieter season than the busy ploughing and harvesting times, and in terms of field work it was, but the winter was not empty of work. The indoor and maintenance tasks of the farming household accumulated during the busy seasons and were attended to in the slower months, and the list of winter work was substantial. Threshing, as we have described, was the primary winter indoor task, the separation of the grain from the straw by flailing, done in batches through the winter months as the grain was needed. The threshing floor of the barn was the scene of a great deal of winter work, the rhythmic sound of the flail a constant background to the shorter days of December and January and February. Two people working together with their flails, striking the spread sheaves alternately in a coordinated rhythm that prevented them from hitting each other and that kept a steady beat against the grain, could thresh a certain quantity each day, and the calculation of how much needed to be threshed against, how much remained in the stack and how far the winter still had to run, was a background calculation that the farming household maintained through the season. The repair of tools and equipment was another winter occupation. The plough handles needed to be checked and any cracked wood replaced before the spring ploughing. The hoe and the spade handles, subjected to the stress of a full season's use, were checked for cracks and loose joints. The harness of the oxen or the horses was inspected and any worn leather replaced, any broken wooden parts of the collar or the traces repaired. The cart was checked for loose spokes and worn wheel rims, the wagon for any damage sustained during the heavy use of the harvest season. This maintenance work was done by the farmer and his household in the evenings and on wet days, the skills required being the basic skills of wood and leather, working that every farming household possessed. Spinning and weaving continued through the winter months at a rate that the summer's outdoor work had not permitted. The wool from the autumn shearing or purchased from the wool merchant was spun through the winter evenings, the distaff and the spindle, or in later periods, the spinning wheel occupying the hands of the women of the household, while the firelight provided enough illumination for the work and the conversation of the evening provided the social context that made even repetitive work companionable. The yarn spun through the winter would be woven into cloth in the following months, and the cloth would be made into garments and into the household textiles that the family needed. The management of the stored grain and the stored preserves was also a winter task. The grain in the barn needed to be turned periodically to prevent it from heating and to ensure even drying. The salted and smoked meat in the storehouse needed to be checked for signs of deterioration, and the storage conditions managed to keep it at the right temperature. The ale needed to be brewed regularly. The supply kept current with the household's consumption. The cheese and the butter needed to be checked and turned. All of these management tasks were individually small, but together they constituted a continuous engagement with the stores that sustained the household, an ongoing attention to the condition of what had been put by in the autumn and what would need to last until the spring. Chapter 20. The Rhythm of the Bells. The church bells organised the medieval farmer's day in a way that was so thoroughly integrated into the pattern of life that their absence would have been as disorienting as the absence of the sun. The bells rang for the canonical hours of the church day, the same hours that organised the monastic day that we described in an earlier story, and the sound of the bells carried across the fields and the commons and the lanes of the medieval countryside, reaching the farmer at work wherever they were, and marking the passage of the day in a way that no watch or clock was needed to supplement. The sound of church bells in the countryside is a particular sound, different from the sound of bells in a town, because in the countryside the bells carry further and there is less other sound for them to compete with. The bell that rang at the end of the working morning calling the village to the midday rest would have been audible to the ploughman at the far end of the furthest strip, clear and direct across the quiet air of the open field, and the ploughman would have heard it with the particular satisfaction of someone who has been waiting for a sound they knew was coming, and who receives it as permission to stop. The bells also marked the non-working occasions of the week and the year. The Sunday bell called the village to church, and the obligation to attend was an obligation with social as well as religious force, the absence of a person from church being noticed and remarked on by the neighbours who were there. The feast day bells marked the holidays of the church calendar when work was prohibited, and the village gathered for the ceremonies and the celebrations that the feast entailed. The occasional special ringing of the bells marked unusual events. The death of a parishioner, the arrival of important news, the beginning of a fire or another emergency that required the community's collective response. The bell ringer was typically a position held by a layman of the parish, sometimes paid a small sum for the service, and the reliable ringing of the bells at the correct times was a service that the whole community depended on. A bell ringer who was inattentive to the time and rang late, or who forgot to ring at all, disrupted the smooth operation of the village's timekeeping in a way that everyone noticed and everyone felt. The bells were the village's public clock, and the maintenance of the clock was the maintenance of the bell ringer's attention to their duty, day after day and week after week, through all the seasons of the year. At night, the bells were quiet. The last bell of the evening, the curfew bell, rang at the hour when the fires were supposed to be covered, and the village was supposed to settle into the quiet of the night. The word curfew, as we noted in an earlier story about medieval laws, comes from the French for cover the fire, and the curfew bell was both a fire safety measure and a signal that the active day was over and the quiet night was beginning. After the curfew bell, the village was officially at rest, and the medieval farmer who had been awake since before dawn and had worked through the full length of the day was ready for that rest with a completeness that the modern reader, reading this story in the late evening, might recognize. The bells are quiet now. The curfew has rung. The village is settling. The fire is banked. The fields are dark. The oxen are in the byre. The grain is in the stack. The pottage has been eaten. The tools are put away. Everything has been done that needed to be done today. And you, lying in the dark of your own night, with no fields and no oxen and no threshing and no ploughing in your morning, are in the same relationship to the dark as every medieval farmer who ever banked their fire and lay down at the end of a long day and felt the tiredness of the day release into the warmth of the bed and the beginning of the sleep. The bells are quiet, the dark is here, the rest is here. Good night. Further reflections on the patience of the farming life. For those still present, here are some further thoughts on the quality of patience that the farming life required, and on what that patience looked like when lived from the inside rather than observed from the outside. Farming in the medieval period required patience in a sense that goes beyond the ordinary meaning of the word. It required the kind of patience that comes from accepting that many of the most important processes are outside your control and operate on their own timescale, and that the correct response to this is to do what can be done, and then to wait without anxiety for what will follow. The grain planted in the autumn would germinate and grow in its own time, not faster because the farmer wanted it to grow faster. The hay would dry when the weather permitted, not before. The calf would be born when it was ready. The butter would come when the cream had been agitated for long enough and the temperature was right. This waiting was not passive. It coexisted with a continuous attentive observation, the farmer checking the germinating grain for signs of disease, watching the sky for the weather that would determine whether the hay could be turned today, feeling the udder of the cow approaching her calving time to assess how close the birth was. The patience was an active patience, a readiness to respond to developments rather than a withdrawal from attention, and it was sustained by the understanding that the processes themselves were reliable, that the grain would germinate if the conditions were adequate, that the calf would come, that the summer would produce a hay crop if the winter had been adequately prepared for. The medieval farmer who had farmed the same ground for 20 years had 20 years of observation to draw on, 20 autumns of ploughing and sowing, 20 springs of germination and growth, 20 summers of hay and harvest, 20 winters of threshing and maintenance and management of the stores. This accumulated observation was not simply knowledge in the abstract sense, but knowledge of this particular field, and this particular season, and this particular animal, knowledge so embedded in the person that it was not a separate thing from the person, but was simply part of what the person was. This kind of knowledge, accumulated over decades of close observation of the same piece of ground and the same community of plants and animals, is a kind of intimacy with the world that the mobility and the specialization of modern life tends to prevent. Most people today do not stay in the same place for 20 years doing the same work with the same land, and the knowledge that comes from that staying is therefore not widely available. But the medieval farmer had it, because the medieval farmer had no alternative to staying, and the staying produced something real and valuable, a thoroughness of knowledge that could not be shortcut or replaced by any amount of general information. And now, lying in the dark at the end of this long story, you have acquired a small amount of knowledge about the medieval farming life, accumulated over the course of this evening, deposited gently in the mind over the chapters of the ploughing and the sowing and the harvesting and the threshing and the long winter evenings. It is not the deep knowledge of the farmer who has done these things for 20 years. It is more like the knowledge of a field seen from a distance, its general shape and character clear, but its detailed texture not yet visible. But it is something, and it is settled now, resting in the mind alongside everything else that is resting there. The accumulated knowledge of a life that is not the medieval farmer's life, but that has tonight shared a small space with it. The field is dark. The knowledge is resting. You are resting. The patience of the farming life is with you now. The particular quality of acceptance and attention that keeps things going through all the seasons and all the years, the steadiness that says the morning will come and the spring will come and the harvest will come and everything that needs to happen will happen in its own time, and tonight is for rest. Rest then. The oxen are dreaming, in whatever way that oxen dream, of the long furrow and the weight of the yoke and the turning of the wide arc at the headland. The sheep are dreaming in the fold of the summer grass and the shepherd's voice at the morning gathering. The farmer is dreaming in the darkness of the medieval house of nothing in particular, just the deep, dreamless rest of a body that has worked all day and lies down without resistance and is asleep before any dream has the chance to form. And you are sleeping, or very nearly sleeping, or in the warm dark of the boundary between the two, where the wakefulness is so thin that the sleeping is already present through it. The two states barely distinguishable. The mind already in the field of the dream where nothing in particular is happening and everything is warm and still. Good night. The field is dark and still. The fire breathes in the grate. The world is resting. Sleep. One more thing. The view from the headland. There is one last image worth holding before sleep comes entirely, and it is the image of the ploughman at the headland. The headland was the strip of uncultivated land at each end of the ploughing strips. the turning space where the ploughing team made the wide arc that reversed their direction at the end of each furrow. The headland was broader than the strips, and was the place where the plough was lifted from the soil and set down again, where the oxen rested briefly before the next furrow, where the ploughman stood for a moment looking down the length of the strip they had just completed, assessing the straightness of the furrow and the evenness of the ploughing before turning the team for the next pass. This moment at the headland, this brief pause between one furrow and the next, was one of the few moments in the working day when the ploughman stood still and looked, not moving and not directing, but simply seeing the work that had been done. The ploughed strip behind them, dark and turned and regular, extending back along the length of the field to the previous headland, was the evidence of the morning's effort, the visible record of what the oxen and the ploughman together had accomplished, and the ploughman who looked at it had the straightforward satisfaction of someone who can see what they have done. The view from the headland on a clear autumn morning with the frost off the ground and the sky pale blue above the bare trees at the edge of the field was a view of the farmland in its particular beauty, the beauty of a landscape that has been shaped by human work over centuries but that retains the qualities of the natural world, the curves of the hills and the lines of the hedges and the colours of the season in the trees and the sky. The ploughman who stood at the headland and looked at this view was not necessarily thinking about its beauty. They were thinking about the next furrow and whether the team was rested enough and how many more strips needed to be done before the field was finished. But the view was there, and the coolness of the morning air was there, and the smell of the turned earth was there, and all of these things were part of the experience of standing at the headland, even if they were not the subject of any conscious thought. The turned earth has a particular smell, unlike any other smell, the smell of the soil opened and aerated by the plough, the complex chemistry of the living soil released into the air, earthy and clean and faintly sweet, the smell of the grounds, interior made briefly external before the weather and the growing of the crop close it again. Anyone who has been present when a field is being ploughed knows this smell. It is not a subtle smell or an ambiguous one. It is direct and clear and unmistakably itself. The smell of earth, which is the oldest smell, which has been there since before there were fields or ploughs or ploughmen, and which will be there long after. You do not need to be at the headland to imagine that smell. You only need to remember it, or to let the description of it evoke something similar, and the imagination does the rest, filling in the details with whatever it has available, producing something that is not precisely the medieval headland, but that has enough of its quality to carry the mind to a place that is open and cold and smells of turned earth, and has a long view ahead of it, and a long dark behind. The ploughman turns the team. The oxen lean into the yoke. The plough enters the soil. The furrow begins again, and you're not in the field. You're in the warm dark, and the field is a long way away, and the ploughing is 1,000 years ago, and the smell of the turned earth is only the memory of a description, fading as everything fades into the deeper quiet of the approaching sleep. Let it fade. Let the field go. Let the headland go, and the oxen and the plough and the frost and the bare trees at the edge of the field and the pale blue of the autumn sky. Let all of it go into the dark that holds everything at the end of every day. The dark is old and very patient. It will hold you too. Good night. Sleep. The field is resting. The soil is quiet. The furrow is complete. Everything is done. A note on the smell of new bread. There is one more thing, and it is a small thing, and then we are finished. The smell of bread baking in the farmhouse oven or on the flat stone beside the fire was one of the most consistent smells of medieval domestic life, because bread was baked regularly, and the smell of it baking was therefore a regular feature of the household air. In the morning, when the dough that had been set to rise the night before was put to bake, the smell spread through the house and beyond it into the farmyard and the lane, a warm and particular smell that is as recognizable today as it was then, because it has not changed, because the chemistry of wheat and heat has not changed, because the smell of baking bread is the smell of baking bread in any century and any place where people bake it. The loaf that came from the fire or the oven was placed on the table and cut with the knife, and the inside of the loaf, exposed by the cutting, was warm and yielding and had its own particular smell that was different from the smell of the baking, slightly yeasty, slightly nutty, the smell of the bread's interior, which was softer than the crust, and which absorbed the butter or the fat or whatever was spread on it with a willingness. That is one of the pleasures of fresh bread in any period. The medieval farmer who cut a fresh loaf and ate it with whatever the household had to eat it with had an experience that is not dramatically different from the experience of eating fresh bread today, because the bread itself is not dramatically different, and the satisfaction of eating warm, fresh bread after physical work is not dramatically different. The continuity is real, and it is comfortable. The knowledge that something so simple and so familiar has been the same for so long, the smell and the taste and the warmth of it unchanged across the centuries. The bread is eaten. The day is done. The fire is quiet. The smell of the bread is fading into the general warmth of the house. The night is here, the same night that has always followed the same day, the dark that comes after the light and holds the sleeping world until the light returns. You are in the dark. You are part of the sleeping world. You are resting in the same rest that the medieval farmer rested in, the same physical and complete surrender of the tired body to the darkness and the warmth that has been the shape of sleep since there were people to sleep and days to rest from. Let the rest complete itself. You do not need to do anything more. The bread has been baked and eaten. The field has been ploughed and sown. The animals are settled. The grain is in the store. Everything has been done that the day required. Good night. Sleep well. The dark holds you. The morning will come when it comes. For now there is only the rest, and the rest is enough, and it is here, and it is yours, and it requires nothing of you at all. Sleep. The soil is quiet in the dark. The ridge and furrow of the old strips press gently into the earth, holding the memory of 10,000 ploughings in their gradual undulations. The oxen are still. The bells are still. The grain is still in the store where it was put. The hedge is still along the field edge, its roots deep in the ground that the medieval farmer also stood on. Everything that was put in place by patient hands over patient years is still there, in one form or another, in the earth or in the record or in the architecture of the landscape that still carries the shape of the work that was done in it. And you are still too, in the warm dark, at the end of the day, at the beginning of the sleep. Good night. The field is resting. The dark endures. The morning will come. Sleep well. The ploughman has laid down the handles. The sickle is put away. The flail is resting against the barn wall. The oxen breathe in the byre. The sheep are folded. The fire is banked low in the hearth. Everything is as it was and as it should be. The night is long and quiet and patient, and it is holding you, and it will hold you until morning, which is a long way away and does not need to be thought about at all. Sleep now. Sleep. The field is dark. The furrows are still. The ridge and furrow holds the memory of the ploughing in the patient earth. The hawthorn in the hedge is bare and still in the winter dark. The seed is in the cold ground, waiting for the warmth of spring that is weeks away. The stored grain is in the barn, quiet, sustaining the household through the dark months. The salted meat is in the store. The ale is in the barrel. Everything that was prepared in the long labour of the summer and the autumn is here, ready, waiting to be needed. And you are here too, resting in the warmth that the preparations of your own day have made possible, in the quiet that the end of the working hours has produced,